Hi everyone, my name's Dividor, and today we're doing a Strength Gravity Mage build, which was a request from a viewer. It took me a couple tries to get this one to a point where I was satisfied with it, but it was worth the effort because it's really fun to use. If you find this video helpful, please leave a like, share the video, and consider subscribing. It really helps me out. As usual, I make my builds at level 125 using the Wretch as my starting class. These are just my personal preferences, and you can make this build at any level you want using any class. If you're making it from scratch, then the optimal class would be the Astrologer, which will get you 4 extra stat points to work with. But if not, then it's not really a huge deal. First off are the stats. Like I always say, Vigor is by far the most important stat in any build, and for this one we've got 50 Vigor. Preferably you would get 60, and if you level this build past 125, then that's the first thing you should increase, but I went with 50 to free up a few extra points because this build has some fairly demanding stat requirements. It's a difference of less than 200 health, so it's not a terrible trade-off. Next is Mind, which we have at 25. Normally I'd go with 15 to 20 Mind for a build like this, but I really wanted to be able to cast the spells a bunch without constantly running out of FP, so I went with 25 for this one. If that's not something you're worried about, or if you're a less optimal class and you have fewer stat points to work with, then you can bring it down to 15 to 20. After that is Endurance, which we have at 13. I prioritized fashion over function when I chose this build's armor, because for one, it's a stat-intensive build, and having something like the Rakshasa set would eat up another 7 or 8 points of endurance that we just can't afford. And two, because it gets boring using the same 2 armor sets all the time, which are usually the Rakshasa set and the Knight armor. So I did my best to optimize the armor and endurance to be able to use any of the loadouts I set up without going into heavy load, and we'll talk about those in the weapons and talisman sections. Now come the damage stats. The viewer who requested this wanted a strength and gravity magic build, so of course I split the stats between strength and intelligence. I went with 38 strength, which doesn't look like a lot, but works for a couple reasons. For one, we're also using the High Glintstone crown, which increases strength and intelligence by 2 points each, so that brings us up to the 40 strength soft cap. Also, strength has the benefit of gaining a 50% effective strength increase when two-handing a weapon, so that means we effectively have 60 strength for most purposes. Now, unfortunately, the two-handing bonus doesn't apply to Ashes of War, meaning if you use something that does a direct attack with the weapon itself, such as Lion's Claw or Piercing Fang, then it'll calculate your damage using 40 strength, but that's still a reasonable amount to get good results. In addition to that, I brought Dex to 12 just to meet some weapon requirements, namely the Star Scourge Greatsword and Alabaster Lord's Sword, and then I dumped any leftover points into Intelligence, which came out to 46, boosted to 48 with the High Glintstone crown. I aimed for 48 specifically because that's the amount required to use the Blades of Stone spell, which is cool as fuck and pretty strong, and it's also just short of the 50 intelligence soft cap for elemental attack power, meaning we'll get pretty good damage from most weapons that scale with intelligence. Now, if you're concerned about not hitting the soft caps, I'll write about it down in the description, but basically, soft caps aren't necessarily something to aim for, but rather, they're something not to pass. There's nothing special that happens when you hit a soft cap. You don't get like a damage bonus or anything like that. The soft cap is just a point where you get diminishing returns afterwards, and so you're encouraged then to start putting your points elsewhere, so not hitting a soft cap doesn't make the build less effective or anything like that. So don't worry too much about arbitrarily hitting those specific numbers. That's it for the stats, so now let's move on to the weapons, talismans, and armor. For our weapons, I didn't have a specific weapon to focus on, and so I included a bunch of options that work well with the build. Most of these were options that the build planner I use, which is linked down in the description by the way, calculated would get the best damage with our stats. You'll notice they're pretty much all strength weapons with the magic affinity, which makes sense considering we've got high strength and intelligence, and you've got a bunch of options here. I'm not going to go into each one in detail, but you'll also notice I included a few loadouts in the build planner for some specific options. There's a generalized one, which lets you use whatever weapon from the build inventory. I just bit the fuck out of my tongue, that hurt, ow. And then there are specific ones for specific weapons like the Ruin's Greatsword. These have matching talisman loadouts, so make sure you look at those too, if you want to use them to their maximum effectiveness. There are a couple common weapons that most of the loadouts share, and those are as follows. First, there's a dagger with the Golden Vow Ash of War. Golden Vow is a buff that increases all damage you do by 11.5% and reduces all damage you take by 7.5% for 45 seconds, making it a great general purpose buff. There's also the Academy Glintstone Staff and the Meteorite Staff. With our stats, the Academy Staff gets the highest sorcery scaling, meaning it'll get the optimal damage when we cast damaging spells. I included the Meteorite Staff because it buffs gravity spell damage by 30% when you hold it in your other hand. So what you want to do is cast spells with the Academy Staff while you hold the Meteor Staff in your other hand, which will make you do a ton of damage with the gravity spells. Up next are the Talismans, and this is pretty much the same story as with the weapons. I included a bunch of good options in the build inventory, and I made a bunch of loadouts that you can use based on your weapon loadout. I won't explain all of them in detail, but I will say that the 3 numbered ones are general purpose setups which you can use based on how you want to play, focusing on spells, focusing on Ashes of War, or focusing on bonk, aka using your weapons two-handed and going for melee attacks like strength builds like to do. Then there are setups for specific weapon loadouts, like for the Ruins Greatsword, which needs the Great Jar's Arsenal to prevent you from going into heavy load, so make sure you use the right talismans based on your loadout. Now comes the armor, and this one is a lot simpler than the weapons and talismans. I chose the first setup with fashion in mind, using the High Glintstone Crown, which also boosts our strength and intelligence by 2 points each, but reduces max FP by 9%, which isn't that bad. The Battle Mage robes, the Knight gauntlets, and the Bandit boots. I didn't use the Battle Mage hand wraps or leg wraps because they're fugly as hell, and these gauntlets and boots provide marginally better protection, which is nice to have. There are also outfits for a couple loadouts, including one for jump attack spam, which swaps the Battle Mage robes to the Gravebird's Black Quill armor for its jump attack damage buff, or if you don't have the DLC, you can use the Raptor's Black Feathers. It also removes the gauntlets to stay in medium load, so keep that in mind. And then there's one for the Venomous Fang, which swaps the High Glintstone Crown out for the Mushroom Crown, which gives you a 10% damage buff for 20 seconds after proccing Poison or Rot, which helps to give the Venomous Fang its insane damage output. Now let's talk about the spells and other buffs we're going to use. We've got pretty high intelligence, which means we get access to a lot of sorceries, and the gravity magic ones are the ones I prioritized. First, there's Great Glintstone Shard, which isn't a gravity spell, but is a good bread and butter spell to use for attacking stuff from range. There are other spells in this same category that you could use, like Comet and Night Comet, which do better damage per cast, but Great Glintstone Shard is much more FP efficient, and I wanted to make the gravity spells the main source of spell damage, so that's what I chose. There's Rock Sling, which is a gravity spell that does physical damage and decent poise damage. There's Collapsing Stars, which does magic damage and can be used to do some cool looking combos against mobs. There's Gravitational Missile from the DLC, which can be used to either stun lock groups of mobs, or if you cast it up against a wall, you can basically just make an explosion centered on yourself that does a bunch of magic damage. And there's Blades of Stone, also from the DLC, which does a ton of physical and poise damage and can be charged to hit multiple times. You could also use stuff like Meteorite or Meteorite of Estelle, but Meteorite is kinda underwhelming, and Meteorite of Estelle requires 55 intelligence to cast, which we couldn't really afford at level 125. If you go to like level 150, then yeah, you can absolutely add that to the build if you want to just obliterate large bosses though. We've also got Terra Magica, which creates a circle on the ground that increases your magic damage by 22.5% while you're standing in it. Keep in mind that this means the elemental damage type known as magic damage, not magic that you cast. For example, Rock Sling is a magic spell, but it does physical damage, so it will not be boosted by Terra Magica. But Terra Magica is good on this build because most of the weapons and spells do indeed do magic damage. In our Wondrous Physic, we've got the Opaline Hardtear, which increases all damage negations by 15% for 3 minutes, and makes you tanky as hell, especially when combined with our other buffs. And we've also got the Magic Shrouding Crack tier, which increases all magic damage you do by 20% for 3 minutes, complementing our magic weapons and spells. If you have the DLC, then you might consider swapping the Opaline Hardtear to the Blood-Sucking Crack tier, which increases all damage you do by 20% for 3 minutes, including physical and magic damage, but also drains your health by around 20 points per second. If you want to see big damage numbers, then that's absolutely the way to go, but I personally don't care for the HP drain, so I usually don't use it. In addition to those, we've also got Boiled Crab, which is a consumable that increases your physical negation by 20% for 60 seconds, further increasing how tanky you are. Depending on the way you play, you may also want to consider using Offsack, which increases all damage you do by 10% for 60 seconds. See my video about it if you want to know more. And that's it for the build. I'm trying to cut down on the length of my videos because nobody watches things like the gameplay showcase or the leveling guide. If you want to see those, then let me know and I'll put them back in the videos going forward. But for the time being, I'm trying to see what happens when I do it without them because I want more audience retention, engagement, stuff like that. But as for the gameplay showcase, where normally I would give you tips and stuff, you've seen plenty of the gameplay in the background of the video as it's been going on. Basically, just make sure you use your buffs. That's the main tip that I've got, because lots of people neglect their buffs. You want to drink your Wondrous Physic, then eat a Boiled Crab, then cast Golden Vow, and then cast Terra Magica, and, you know, that'll buff all your shit, and make sure you're doing a lot of damage and not taking all that much damage, and you should be fine. You know, try to cast your spells during punish windows or when the enemy is stance broken or something like that. You don't want to try to spam spells and then get blasted by the enemy while you're mid-animation, you know? But yeah, so if you enjoyed this video, please leave a like, share the video, and consider subscribing because it all really helps me out. If you have any build requests, then leave them in the comments down below, and I'll add them to my list. My name is Diabetor, and I will catch you later.